Another interesting feature that you can do or trigger from your webhook is the follow-up event. Now, what is a follow-up event? When you have intent which is triggered by a call to an event, you know that you can trigger that intent by using, like for example, you can use the REST API and you can send in the event name and it will actually trigger that particular intent. It's commonly used for the welcome intent, which means from different channels you can just trigger that event and that will start the conversation from the dialog flow's end. That is, dialog flow will send the initial message, which usually is not possible. As you know, dialog flow follows this request response paradigm where the user usually has to send in a request first for dialog flow to be able to respond back to the user. So that is how the events work in general. In the case of follow-up events, these are similar events except that they are going to be triggered by the webhook code instead of being triggered by the API code. So when you trigger the event and correspondingly the intent from the REST API, those are regular events. On the other hand, if you trigger the event and correspondingly the intent from the webhook code, those are called follow-up events. So with that being clarified, if you take a look at the JSON we have to use for the follow-up event, you can see that you just have this follow-up event input field, and below that we have this list of parameters. Now I went in and did some, just experimented with the JSON a bit, and I realized that you only need to have this name field set. So in the response editor inside the mockable.io service, I just have this simple response coming back. You have this flower bracket container as usual, and then follow-up event input is the name of the field, and inside that you have one more called name, and then the name of the event that I'm going to use is going to be example. So let's go back to Dialogflow, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new intent, and I'm going to call this intent intent triggered by follow-up event, just so that it's clear. And then I'm just going to add this as the event. It's just going to be called example. And in the text response, I'll say this intent was triggered by the webhook follow-up event, which is what happened, of course, if this was done correctly, right? So you have this intent, which is, as you can see, it has no training phrases. So for this intent to even get triggered, the follow-up event has to work as expected. And we have the default welcome intent as always, and you can see that it makes a call to the webhook. Now just imagine we use the phrase to trigger this intent, something like hello or hi there or something, and if there was no follow-up event, what should happen is that the default welcome intent will be the one which is triggered, and it should set this context called awaiting underscore birth date, and the response should be whatever comes back. Right now it's empty, but whatever the webhook would have sent, or the usual response is what we expect. But because we have created this follow-up event input as the response in the JSON, notice what happens when we send this request across. Let's just say I say hello there. So you can see what happened is it triggered the it basically triggered this event called example, and in our case the example event is located inside this intent triggered by follow-up event intent, but you also see that the context is set. So that's something that you might want to make note of. The context from the original intent is actually it still gets set despite the call to the other intent, because as you know, the intent triggered by follow-up event over there, we don't set any output context here, right? It has no training phrase, no output context, no input context, nothing. It's just there is the event here and then there is this response here. So this is the way you trigger the follow-up events by using the JSON. And as you can see, I distilled it down to really the essence of what you need to be able to trigger the follow-up event from the webhook code. So if you want to use it, this is how you can do that. Now, having said all this, I'm just going to add a little sort of rider based on my experiences. Now, I've received questions from readers and sometimes clients asking like they usually like draw out a specific scenario and ask like, hey, is it a good idea to use follow-up events for this particular use case? And in pretty much every single case, I have been able to not use the follow-up event, and I've been able to do the same task by using a combination of other features which are already there in Dialogflow. So from my experience till now, I have a feeling that the follow-up event is sort of the last resort, and I don't see too many cases where it actually makes like a obvious first choice candidate for some feature or something that you want to implement. In fact, till now, I've never actually had to use it. So I don't know whether that says something or not. It's not obviously possible for me to know every single scenario where this is used, but this is what I've noticed. So you may just want to keep that in mind. If you are using the follow-up event to do something, there's probably other ways to implement the same result, to achieve the same result rather, and you may want to look into that also. So, but if you end up saying that no, I've looked at all the other possibilities and this is the only way I can get my goal, if I can achieve my goal, then yeah, this is how you implement the follow-up event from your JSON.